Last Sunday, several Abbey residents listened to an online program called Ready to Resist Emergency Call. It was coordinated by the Move On organization, and that audio program is still available for listening online, and we will post the address at the end of this BBC for anyone who'd like to listen. There were many racial equality and justice groups co-sponsoring the event, and with little notice, over 34,000 people signed up to listen in on the call. Um, the moderator began by asking, how do we confront white supremacy in all its forms? Since the Trump campaign started just 2 years ago, there has been a noticeable spike in the number of organized hate groups and in the number of hate crimes targeting people of color in particular. So what are we to do? Our work is to oppose white supremacy in all its visible and invisible forms by opposing hate groups and hate speech, by taking down racist monuments, by rooting out laws that discriminate against minorities, and by reversing laws based on white supremacy, like the Muslim ban and the immigration laws, budget cuts for social programs such as Medicaid and Medicare, etc. Sanity and decency, the moderator said, have prevailed because of good planning and resistance. And Mr. Trump was abandoned by so many people this past week. Republicans, some of the Republicans, many CEOs of corporations. There are a number of fewer Confederate monuments from public squares that have been taken down. And the 40,000 people in Boston clearly outnumbered the white supremacists or the white nationalists. So the first speaker on the call was the vice mayor of Charlottesville, Wes Bellamy, I think his name is. And even as we heard in our conversation with Jeffrey Hopkins, he was explaining why the white nationalists decided to go to Charlottesville. Perhaps it was because the city had allowed for a meeting of white supremacists prior to that meeting, and then it was agreed for this. It sounds like maybe the city tried to deny the white nationalists the opportunity to come to the city, but it sounded like it was taken through the courts, and there was no way to avoid being able to host it once it had gotten started. So, but the vice mayor wanted to emphasize that Charlottesville is a city of opportunity, that they've recently passed an equity package that he sponsored or co-sponsored, $4 million, helping to bridge the gap between whites and people of color. And so that's primarily what he talked about, the money that was $2.5 million that was earmarked for public housing redevelopment, for an African American Heritage Center, a park in a local African American community, and some annual tuition for GED training for students who live in public housing, and also a sizable amount of money for anyone who lives 80% below the annual median income to have access to public housing and scholarships to local community colleges. So he was trying to present that Charlottesville is not a haven just for white nationalists, but rather is a thriving place for a very diverse community. Then two senior trainers spoke next. And the first one was Eric Ward. He's a senior fellow at the Southern Poverty Law Center. And he was trying to explain white supremacy in America today. How did we get here? What are some of the key points that have brought us to this place in our American culture? He said that we need to understand that white nationalism is a response to some of the progress that our country has made in over the last 50 years. And the reaction, in large part, has to do with the 1964 civil rights movement. There were three pivotal moments that he focused on. In the mid-60s, in the US, there was a very significant civil rights movement, and that was pretty effective in pushing back against white supremacy, which was codified by law at the time. In the wake of those victories, white supremacy began to retreat, at least it seemed. But within that retreat, white nationalism then had a platform to begin developing, and they sought to create an ethno-state, which the next speaker spoke about quite a bit. So to support the rhetoric that blacks were inferior, less intelligence, they needed a reason to explain their loss in the civil rights movement. And so they began to create a model from the anti-Semitism that mirrored what happened in Europe, portraying Jews as secretly plotting to destroy the white race. And so there was a story generated, something similar among the black community. The next appearance of the white nationalist movement, he noted, was in 1979 during the Greensboro massacre. What was significant was that we began to see elements of neo-Nazis, Klansmen, skinheads, and paramilitaries unifying around the idea of no longer trying to retake the United States, but in fact wanting to overthrow the US and create an ethno-state where people of color would no longer be allowed. Did any of you know about that? Okay, yeah, it's interesting, but I guess this is what the research shows. Then more recently, in the spring of 2017, we began to see this movement take root on the streets of Portland with the murders of two people who were trying to protect, who stood up for two African-American women on public transportation, two Muslim women. And in the wake of that, it signaled to the white nationalist movement that it could begin to expand and build a mass base, particularly under the shadow of the electoral success of Donald Trump. So he emphasized that we should be very clear that white nationalist goal is to seize state power. And that seems to be what's happening, or attempting to be, going on now. Their understanding is that the best way to dismantle American government is by being in control of American government. And the best way they believe they can create an ethno-state is by controlling the current government and deconstructing a lot of the governmental policies and institutions that we currently rely on. So they seek to do this using fear and imitation, like we saw in Charlottesville, attacking a multiracial society, trying to create this narrative that a multiracial society can't work. So, you know, he was emphasizing that leaders need to step up and deal with some of these systemic assaults, both in our institutions of democracy and also addressing some of the bias and discrimination that already undercuts our ability to build a real inclusive society. Also, they're undermining democratic institutions. You know, there are various standoffs with federal government, ignoring laws at the city and state level to prove to the American public that they are a stronger force. So it's all smoke and mirrors, at least to some degree. They're not as big as they claim to be. So it's important to realize, he said, that bigotry and prejudice is not their goal. These are not simply anti-hate groups. It's not a behavioral problem. It's a social movement that uses bigotry and prejudice with the intention to seize the state. That's quite a reframe. So what can we do? This is the moment when it's critical that we take steps as leaders. So he was suggesting three things. We need to talk to friends and neighbors to break the paralysis and to build solidarity. If we're unable to work up the courage to talk to our friends and neighbors about these difficult issues like race and inequality and lack of justice, how will we ever build the courage to confront a social movement that seeks to undercut the idea of a people-centered democracy? That's one thing. We need to find creative responses. And so he also cited the creative response that was seen in Germany in that one town where people turned an annual neo-Nazi march into a fundraiser for anti-hate groups. So he said that's something that we need to do much more of, is to find creative responses. And also we need to build an inclusive democracy that is people-centered, transparent, and accountable. So this is how we inoculate our communities from this kind of attack. He said it's important to understand that hate groups don't simply come to town bringing racism, anti-Semitism, or homophobia. Rather, they simply organize on the bigotry that already exists. So we need to be a leader and join one of the organizations, the many organizations that co-sponsored this call, and you can find those on the website. And he suggested that we double our activities with such organizations. We need to talk to family and neighbors and tell elected officials to take a stand. And also, when we stand up for our neighbors and our friends, we're standing up for ourselves and our families as well. Because we're trying to build a real democracy, and that will only succeed if we deal with the underlying issues of bigotry and discrimination already present in our society, as well as counter this white nationalist movement. We need both. And so this is a critical moment in history. Then the next speaker was very compelling. His name was Tarso Luis Ramos, the executive director of Political Research Associates. And he emphasized that this is not a Southern problem. This is a national problem, and to some extent, it's an international problem. So his group, Political Research Association, has been creating investigative research and analysis, as well as challenging the nationalistic right wing and advocating for social justice since 1991. So he emphasized that it's important to understand their very effective coalition building tactics, that they are there are intersecting targets for the right based on race, religion, class, gender, and sexuality. And so it's important to come to each other's aids. White nationalists have sought to build beyond their relatively small ranks with Trump supporters and others by mobilizing fear, resentment, and anger against multiple groups, courting relationships with, for example, Islamophobes within and outside the religious right, anti-government patriotic paramilitary groups such as the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters. I need to read more about those groups to find out who they are. Also the men's movement. They're misogynists. There's quite a misogynist movement within this country. Immigrant activists and so on. So it's a multifaceted approach of attack. And this is what's making it so effective. Also, the alt-right moniker coined by Richard Spencer reflects an attempt to reach beyond people willing to openly embrace the belief that the white race is superior on one hand, and racially exclusionary definitions of who is a real American. Islamophobia has been an especially effective tool because it masks the racial element of white nationalists by coding it within religion. These coalitions also allow the movement to blend in with pro-Trump rallies, using free speech as a cover, like they tried in Boston. Anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and anti-black racism were on display in Charlottesville with chants of "Jews will not replace us" and "blood and soil" directly from the Third Reich and so forth. He said we must also pay attention to the intense misogyny on display. For example, the Daily Stormer, which is I guess, part of the white nationalist website, mocked Heather Heyer the day after she was killed in Charlottesville, and also women protesters in Charlottesville were threatened with rape as they were protesting. So white nationalists also represent a violent culture of hypermasculinity that is intensely misogynistic, and this too has to be confronted and addressed. The second key point that he made is the Nazification of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, with very prominent neo-Nazis and other white supremacists like David Duke scheduled to speak. So this prevents a double-edged sword of going forward in the work to defend racial justice and democracy. Why? Because it shocked the nation that people came out without their hoods in plain daylight. It shocked the nation. It compelled members of the Trump party to strongly denounce the Unite the Right rally and to begin challenging Trump's weak leadership in denouncing that violence. So it's our job to keep focused on the racist policies, specifically on the racist policies of the Trump administration, and not let these demonstrations to take our attention, but really to keep an eye on what's happening on immigration, Muslim bans, police violence and mass incarceration, on women's health, health insurance, voter suppression, and minority education. We can't let the focus on the Nazis serve to mainstream the other militant groups on the far right. So he gave an example that the armed paramilitaries, called the Oath Keepers, in Portland, Oregon, the Republican Party decided to use them as a security detail in which they cooperated with local police in arresting counter-protesters at white nationalist rallies. Isn't that interesting? So they're being normalized, you see? And unless we're clear about the relationship between vigilantly white nationalists and racist nationalism on offer from Trump and his government, then these cultural mobilizations on the right can open up for more space for racist policies and aggressive policing. The third point that he brought out was that white nationalism is a social movement with a political agenda. It mobilizes hatred. If we focus on them as haters, though, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that they're part of a larger anti-democracy movement that threatens racial justice and democracy in America. And so to counter this, we all must practice democracy in our resistance. So he gave some really good principles to consider. He said, if they come for one of us, they must come for all of us. So we need to practice deep solidarity um, with other minority groups. We also need to defend those targeted for political retaliation and never give up on the formal institutions of democracy, no matter how inadequate they may currently be as guarantors of our justice and equality. He said we must keep our hearts open and lead with love, even as we passionately defend human rights. And he highlighted that defense is never enough. We must lead with an alternative vision of democracy and human rights. Democratic Party, are you listening? Okay. So then the first set of actions that were mentioned on this call, one was by Congressman Bonnie Watson Coleman, a black congresswoman from the 12th District of New Jersey. And she's the one who co-sponsored this resolution to censor the president so that congressmen and congresswomen can go on record to denounce the president's callous and unenlightened remarks about Charlottesville. There were about 100 co-sponsors on this bill, and it's specifically for Republicans who have tweeted Democratic principles to go on record condemning what the president has said and not said. And they've had many opportunities to speak out on what Trump has done. So this is a modest resolution to ask members of Congress to go on record to state that Trump's ideologies are not the ideologies of the American people. Then there was a very interesting speaker, Arisha Hatch. She's the managing director of campaigns at Color of Change. That's the country's largest online black-led racial justice organization. And their organization is primarily focused on helping people of color to channel their anxieties and fear into strategic action, giving people something to do with their outrage and fear, which is very proactive. Since January, they've been asking people to take strategic actions to push back against enablers and normalizers of Trump's dangerous rhetoric and policies, asking elected officials and corporations to take a side and to not comply. And after the Muslim ban, Color of Change demanded that Uber quit Trump's business council. I don't quite understand the connection there, but evidently there is one. They also actively petition large corporations like Tesla, Disney, and Pepsi to get them to stand down from these corporate councils that Trump had built up. And we saw they were one group doing that. We saw some of the results of that this last week. So she was really urging people to get involved in certain actions, like to demand that we tear down all the Confederate symbols in our nation's capitals, and also putting pressure on companies like Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and Discovery, who are processing money on over 100 hate group sites. And already PayPal and Apple Pay have begun to remove their support for such sites. And so we need to take some action with these other larger groups to help to get them to go along with this as well. Then there was a woman there was a man who was talking about the Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools, that racism and white supremacy show up not just in white-hooded people, but also in public policy. And so this is evident in a lot of the policies that are coming out of the Department of Education right now. So I guess the department wants to cut $2 billion from Title I funding that is specifically targeted for after-school programs, community schools, and the arts programs, specifically in low-income and black communities. They also want to eliminate $400 million used to address the school climate, and it also addresses the use of exclusionary disciplinary actions for kids of color. And also, this is a program that helps to reduce or address the school-to-prison pipeline. So she also had a number of action points that we can look at on the website. It's called reclaimourschools.org. So all of these different websites of how we can take at least some action. Writing letters may not be the only thing that we do, but it is a step. And especially if we show our solidarity, numbers speak volumes, don't they? So these were some of the highlights from this talk. I found it very both chilling and encouraging. But we need to know what's happening in the country. We need to know what we're dealing with. And it seems like a very well thought out, multifaceted approach to undermining American democracy. So let's get busy.
This social movement sounds suspiciously like what Hitler did in 1920, 1930. He took hate and he used it as a platform to destroy the democracy. The Weimar Republic at that time was a democracy. Yeah. And it's really scary, the parallels going on here.
So one of the things that to keep in mind too is that the young men who are flocking, the young white men who are flocking to these movements are doing so because they have some unmet needs, or they perceive that they have some unmet needs. So in trying to reduce the impact of the appeal of these movements, I think that it would be helpful for the society at large to figure out what those unmet needs are and try to provide them for those young men who may be feeling left out, disenfranchised, without education, fearing no opportunity for jobs, for advancement, for whatever it is that their goals are in life. And so I think by doing so, we are stopping or forestalling them from then seeking refuge or seeking help from these other avenues that are destructive.